Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Quorum Podcast. This is where academic medicine meets remote, austere, and resource-limited areas.
Hello, and welcome back to the program. My name is Aebhric. Today, I am with David Fifer, who is assistant professor at EKU in Kentucky. He runs the Paramedic to degree program there, but we're talking to him today about some of his other activities that he's been doing. He's a FOM, and he created the WPC. I know you had help there, but you definitely were a mover and shaker. So, David, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks very much. Good to be here.
Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, you you kind of you nailed the high points there. Full time, I'm faculty at Eastern Kentucky University. We have a brick and mortar paramedic program. It's actually a baccalaureate paramedic program that has existed since. Technically, the whole program's existed since 1976. And then in addition to teaching kind of the typical, EMT and paramedic courses, although at the baccalaureate level, I run our online degree programs, like you mentioned. So we have some opportunities for paramedics who are interested to get a bachelor's degree in emergency medical care online. And then I'm also the director of the Center for Wilderness and Outdoor Public Safety here at the university. And what we do there is try to focus on delivering evidence-based training to professionals who have a duty to respond basically in outdoor spaces. So, park rangers, game wardens, conservation law enforcement officers, wildland firefighters, search and rescue responders, those kinds of people. So we teach, wilderness medicine courses, a little bit of rope rescue, some risk management kinds of courses, and boutique kinds of training, some contract, kinds of courses for different clients and stuff like that. And then in my volunteer time, I run a team called Red Star, and that stands for Red River Gorge Special Treatment Access and Rescue Team. Yes, we did rip it off from Boar Star with the U.S. Border Patrol.
Yeah, the Border Patrol guys.
Yeah, we were like, we wanna. That's cool. But at the risk of flattering ourselves too much, it's actually a very similar ConOps to what they do. Obviously not like a national security kind of a mission or anything like that, but we have this recreation area here in Kentucky called the Red River Gorge. Gets an insane amount of visitors every year, close to 1 million visitors, depending on the source you read. And there's all kinds of outdoor stuff going on. But what we're kind of famous for is our cliffs and sandstone arches, and it's very rugged. So people are getting hurt, getting ill out there, and it requires high angle rope techniques to bring care to their side. So we do ALS care right at the point of injury or point of illness out in the wilderness. And we also supply paramedics to Kentucky's hoist rescue program. So I'm a hoist rescue paramedic supporting the Kentucky State Police who operates that aircraft. So that's me in a nutshell, I guess.
That gives you some flight time.
A little bit, yeah.
So you have quite a few irons in the fire, but yet you still are making waves. You still are pushing the envelope a bit. So we'll talk about what you're doing with the degree programs, but tell us a bit about the WPC and how you and IBSC were the movers and shakers behind that. And sure, a lot of us got on board, but we were just putting a little bit of input. You were doing all the heavy lifting. So what is the wilderness paramedic, and how were you involved?
Well, you're selling yourself short. We couldn't have done that project without you and your contributions, as well as many other people around the world. But the true subject matter experts who have like a real global perspective on wilderness medicine and austere medicine. I do a particular flavor of wilderness medicine here in Kentucky, but I don't have the same kind of exposure that you do. So it was a real team effort. All the way, but if there is something that maybe I'm comfortable, I guess maybe sort of taking some credit for, It's that I do think, and I'm very proud that I think Kentucky was kind of the aegis for really creating the concept in with traction. So basically, what happened is, we started doing. We started Red Star. We started doing wilderness medicine here in Kentucky in wilderness EMS in kind of a big way, and the Kentucky Board of EMS, which is our state EMS office, started promulgating regulations and carving out advanced paramedic scopes in certain specialties. So we have in statute here in Kentucky advanced practice paramedic, distinct from sort of typical paramedic. And you can get kind of like specialty credentialing in tactical medicine, flight medicine, critical care medicine generally, community paramedicine, and wilderness paramedicine. And so, we started trying to flesh out all those regulations and realized pretty quickly, hey, there's an IBSC exam for all of those specialties except for wilderness. So we batted around a few ideas. we maybe we could create our own exam here in the state. Maybe we could craft something with some of the other industry players. But we had some connections to IBSC. Some people kind of helped us network into them. We called up IBSC and said, hey, we have this work group here in Kentucky that is trying to really recognize wilderness paramedicine in a way that we don't think any other states are doing, as far as having a specific statutory level of paramedic called wilderness specialist. We were under the impression that here in Kentucky we're the only ones who actually are doing that. And so would you be interested in building an exam for this? And that way we could just kind of reference all of these specialties to the IBSC standard. And they said, yeah, we've gotten a little bit of interest in this over the years. We've heard some people are kind of interested in this. Tell you what, why don't we ask some different kinds of SMEs who we know and see if there's any real interest in this beyond Kentucky. So then they reached out to people like you and others, and found that people really were interested in this. And so then we kind of convened a work group of SMEs, and we built the exam. I think it's pretty cool that Kentucky sort of kind of was the
spark.
Yeah, the spark, exactly. I don't want to be too melodramatic about it, but yeah, it was the spark. We weren't the only ones. But yeah, we really were pretty energetic in trying to get it all together. So yeah, now we have the WPC exam. I'm pretty proud of that. And I think that that's only going to kind of become more popular as we continue to refine it over the next couple of cycles of item writing and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's been interesting to see how that would apply to Africa and other places as well. And we've tried to influence during the development to include remote clinical, austere clinical sites outside of Kentucky. Though you guys have quite a bit of austere environments as well.
Yeah, we do. It's definitely austere. There were some really good conversations during that process. You know about this obviously, but for your listeners, there are some really good conversations about what is the nature of the word, what is the meaning of that word wilderness, versus austere versus remote. And ultimately we settled on wilderness for a few different reasons. I mean, it also, there's context with wilderness. You have the Wilderness Medical Society. You have some other kind of, there's existing kind of usage of that word, which helps to contextualize it a little bit. But we also kind of wanted to define wilderness paramedicine as being more than just sticks and rocks and water. So we do consider austere care in a humanitarian, resettlement camp to be a form of wilderness medicine. We do consider, quote unquote, bush medicine, certainly to be wilderness medicine. So, that's kind of where we settled on it. There was a lot of talk of calling it something like austere paramedic or remote paramedic or something like that. But a goal here was to really really remind people that the skill set of wilderness medicine is applicable to lots of different environments and can be understood through lots of different lenses.
I remember those conversations, and I think WPC wound up being the best option. And calling it remote paramedic, and people are like, "Well, are you on the phone?" Well, I mean, what's
Yeah,
this remote? And then austere is a bit of a stretch, I think, for people.
right,
So WPC works, and there are well, there's wilderness in every continent, so
right, right.
it's applicable.
Yeah, and we wanted to separate it from the tactical paramedic and tactical responder. Sure,
Indeed.
there's a big overlap there, but there's some big distinctions. So, with like austere, we just didn't think that there was a big enough distinction between the tactical realm.
So now that we have this, and you have your WPC, I have I'm 007 number of
Yeah,
WPC.
which is perfect.
You're probably 01, aren't you?
No,
On
I'm
yours.
actually I think I'm 04.
Uh,
So the first three were IBSC board members
oh, that's
who were
fair.
involved
Yeah.
in the project who were also paramedics.
Uh,
Yeah, but I was wondering when you got assigned 007, there is no way that was a mistake.
I have to admit I do owe John Clark a pint when we meet in Malta here next month. So I think it's a fantastic option, and John Clark and I are talking about running a WPC exam at SOMA instead of
Cool.
the normal tactical paramedic. We'll see if the abstract gets picked. But
Yeah, right on.
so so now that we have this, we've had it for 6 months or so. How has this changed your practice, or how has this enhanced Kentucky, the austere environments of Kentucky? How has this benefited the people that you work on?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked me that because it's a good example of why we did this and how we envision it can be used around the world. So, now that we have a validated third party, psychometrically sound, legally defensible exam for this cognitive knowledge, now we can use that as kind of like a key to unlock an advanced scope of practice. So we've this work group that I mentioned leading. We have actually recently, now that the exam is up and running and has been validated and is official, we just submitted our kind of packet of ideas and scope of practice suggestions to the Kentucky Board of EMS. And so it's going to include things like dental care, blood product administration, finger
Wow.
thoracotomy, a different range of pressors. For example, that would be available to a typical paramedic. Canine care, care for working dogs.
Mm,
Reduction of kind of like all the joints that could
yeah.
be reasonably reduced. I could go on, but those are just some examples of things that are fairly specific or a little bit more germane, I guess I would say, to wilderness care that may not be available to the typical paramedic. And so, now we're able to, just like the National Registry exam or any other, kind of, certifying exam like that, we're able to say, hey, this isn't just one company's spin on how to do this that has not been validated beyond, their own company. This isn't some, mom and pop. Hey, I took, David Fifer's woofer course. What does that mean? Here's this exam that we've pulled together all these different people from, COROM to Knowles to individual SMEs to, really the global community of people who are doing this stuff kind of on a regular basis. And we've all agreed that this is the standard of knowledge that you should have. And that is really important. And so that's
Mm,
why we designed the exam. Some people were actually nervous about the exam because they were afraid that it would start to regulate what they do. And they wanted, they felt like there was a little bit of a loss of control there, I think. But
mm,
what we said from the beginning was, we're not trying to regulate all of this. It's just that we want to provide a tool to those communities that do need some sort of reference point for regulation. Kentucky is one of those. I do hope that other states follow suit. I think other states will. I think there's a few states that people involved in those EMS offices have suggested that they would be incorporating this as a regulatory tool. But I think that's really important. I think it's important that wilderness medicine, wilderness EMS, not be the Wild West. I think we need to kind of really come into our own as having standards, regulations, recognized credentials, so that if you have a WPC patch on your shoulder, or you have that in your post-nominal, it is understood what your scope of knowledge is.
Indeed. And I can see the applicability on in pretty much every state. I'm just thinking some of the, like Montana and Wyoming and Kentucky, and I mean, last state I lived in before leaving the States was Alaska, and you were what 6-8 hours by car to the nearest provider. So I'm hoping that the McPees in Alaska are going to pick this up
Yeah.
and be able to have these skills.
Right.
So blood products, you got the third rail to be passed in Kentucky. So how is that? So first off, what blood products are you allowed to give, and then how is
Well,
that conversation?
Well, it's as of this recording, it's not quite done yet. So here in Kentucky, first it has to be approved by the Medical Oversight Committee of the Board of EMS. Then it has to be approved by the Board of EMS. Then it goes to a body called the Legislative Research Commission, which is a state agency that basically vets, validates any public regulations or laws. They do a cost analysis. They make sure that it's consistent with existing laws and all that kind of stuff. So for most EMS regulations, it's mostly a formality, but nevertheless, it still has to pass that hurdle. So it's not quite a done deal yet, but we would like to think that we have gotten all the buy-in that we should have gotten and been inclusive in the deliberations and everything up to this point. And that it will be smooth sailing. So we do anticipate that it will be approved. I think the goal, right, is basically whole blood. And what we would be probably trying to do with that would be, for example, there are in the area where I operate, the Red River Gorge, it's austere, but it's not necessarily remote. In fact, I would argue it's not remote, especially with hoist insertion capability. Now in Kentucky, we can put a paramedic anywhere, in the gorge with, a relatively short order. But it can take a long time to get people out of that environment because of the technical extraction challenges. So we've actually had, for example, 2 or 3 calls recently, like over the past 2 or 3 years, where there was entrapment. So patients, for example, who were pinned under falling trees. We had one a few years ago during the formation of Red Star. It was actually one of the catalysts for building the team. Somebody fell off of a rock, like a prominence, fell like 30 feet. And the way that they landed, their legs got wedged between 2 other boulders. And the initial report was that, they were basically, down to their hip, wedged between these 2 rocks, couldn't get that leg out. So we've had a few of these things that were like entrapments, and we also thought that there might even be a field amputation need. We actually had one of those very recently where we deployed a physician into the field because we thought that we were going to have to cut a guy's leg off. So there are situations like that where, blood products, could make a big difference. Other situations where a patient, suffered really serious traumatic injuries, they definitely have internal hemorrhage occurring. And it's just going to take kind of a long time or long enough to do a rope rescue operation to get them out of the spot that they're in. Just because of the nature of the terrain. So, I've had patients that we've pulled out of 30-foot crevices, and it's almost like a crevasse rescue, but you're talking sandstone instead of a glacier. and they're
Wow.
down in a crack, so we're down there with them for 45 minutes, an hour, while we get things rigged up and pull them up. I think those are situations where it's actually very realistic for us to take refrigerated blood into the woods. It's not that it's a lengthy access to the patient, it's that it's a lengthy extraction of the patient.
Hmm.
So that's the kind of thing we're envisioning.
So you would carry a couple units of fresh whole blood in, and then if you don't use it, you can bring it back and still
Exactly.
make the 21-day limit of
Yeah.
getting it used. Any other products like fresh frozen plasma or just whole blood?
Well, we're considering, I think, some of those other products as well, but I guess sort of the gold standard, if you will, would be the whole blood.
The evidence is there, isn't it?
Hmm.
So besides whole blood, are you bringing in? Does WPC allow additional drugs such as ketamine or what type of hemodynamic drugs are you allowed to have now?
Yeah, so on the ketamine front, that's actually in the baseline paramedic scope here in
Oh,
Kentucky. So
brilliant.
yeah, we actually, Kentucky actually has a great scope of practice for all EMS levels. Um, we so yeah, ketamine is available. But some of what the WPC allows us to do for things that are in the baseline scope already is different protocolization or different kind of bundles of care or different approaches to using those same things. So, um, on the ketamine front, for example, um, it's I guess it's not about ketamine specifically, but joint reduction, right? So
Hmm.
we get a lot of dislocated joints in the gorge, right? So it's people doing athletic kinds of things, and so shoulder dislocations, for example, very common. Some shoulders can be reduced extremely easily, right? To the point that it's actually silly, that it's probably not actually in the EMT scope to be able to just kind of pop an uncomplicated, simple shoulder reduction back in. That's not a big deal. Others are quite difficult, and they actually need basically conscious sedation, all right, to be able to
Hmm.
be done safely, and effectively, and in a way that isn't just absolute torture for the patient. And so again, a lot of times we can access these patients somewhat quickly, but then getting them out of there is what takes a really long time because of the terrain challenges. And if you have somebody whose shoulder is slinged up and swathed up, and maybe even has to be sort of held out, abducted from their body a little bit, improvising almost like a shoulder wedge, that can actually be extremely slow going, to hike them out or to walk them out. And so then you sort of start thinking maybe it's actually safer if we sort of package this patient in a position of comfort in like a basket, and we can control the movements and do some basic rigging and so forth to get around some of these terrain challenges. I guess you could hoist that person out. I mean, I know that there are agencies that hoist out, broken ankles and stuff like that all the time, but the risk benefit proposition just might not be there for a dislocated shoulder. Okay,
Right.
so let's try to put this thing back in place and do a simple sling and swath. But if it's not going well, if it's not kind of easy, if they're all tensed up, if they have a history of this, that, and the other, where there's you know scar tissue or restricted movement or whatever, yeah, let's just snow them, right?
Right.
Let's and so that approach would be something that is uncommon, I think, for paramedics to do generally. But now we're talking about being in the wilderness, having to be cognizant of all the different dynamics there, the pharmacodynamics, the hemodynamics, the airway management issues. What is your plan if this patient has kind of an emergence reaction, when you're out there in the middle of the woods? That stuff, that's exactly what the WPC exam is designed to test. That's exactly
Hmm.
the questions that we put on it. It's about the assimilation of knowledge for, we're going to be doing full scope ALS out here in very remote wilderness environments. So it's not an exam that tests your knowledge of how to make splints out of sticks and paracord. It's an exam that tests your knowledge of, so you want to do some conscious sedation in the wilderness. how do you do that safely? And so it's that kind of modality, I guess, where having that WPC credential now, it makes it a lot more reasonable to write some protocols and come up with some kind of care plans that reflect that level of knowledge.
Agreed. It needs to be critical care knowledge, but be putting that in the remote or austere environment, sort of.
Yep.
And hard questions like propofol versus ketamine, or how
Exactly.
do what are your options for a posterior dislocated versus an anterior dislocated?
Right.
These are hard questions.
Right. Exactly. And so, yeah, it does kind of it gets into the critical care realm a little bit. The WPC exam does not have questions on it about balloon pumps and fetal heart rate monitoring and and
Thankfully, yeah.
LVADs and stuff, but it does have a lot of questions on it about powerful medications, hemodynamics, perfusion concepts, and so yeah, you need to have a really thorough level of knowledge when you're out in environments that you're not just going to be at the hospital with in 15 minutes. You can't always even contact medical control, because of connectivity problems.
Mm.
And not to be corny, but it literally is. No one is coming. It's up to us. And so you got to really be on top of your game, and that's what the WPC credential is designed to communicate. It's a cognitive exam. It's not a skill-based exam. So you're still going to have to get some technical chops, but as far as the knowledge, the idea here is that if you get that WPC patch on your chest rig, if you will, that you know what you're talking about when it comes to doing those kinds of procedures.
But is evidence-based medicine at the bottom of the gorge, as well as evidence-based medicine anywhere? It's
Exactly. And one of
providing
the
the
things,
best care available.
yeah, one of the things that we really stress, I think, from the WPC community is good medicine is good medicine, and obviously there's some unique physiological, pathophysiological considerations with different kinds of environmental pathologies, dive medicine and altitude medicine and stuff like that. And there are some unique approaches to wilderness medicine that would not be maybe appropriate in quote unquote front country medicine. But when you get down to brass tacks, medicine is medicine. So if it's the right thing to do for a patient, basically laying under bright lights, it's probably also what you're going to want to do for the patient if they're out in the woods. And the question is, I guess beyond the obvious, like, is it possible to do that in that environment? The question is, how are you going to do it safely in that environment? And I think that's a big part of what the WPC exam is all about.
It's an incredible challenge and an enjoyable challenge trying to come up with ways to provide that evidence-based medicine in these crazy resource limited environments.
Yeah, it's exactly right. And as I was telling you that story or giving you that example of shoulder dislocations and ketamine and stuff, I was thinking about a call that we had a couple of years ago. A guy dislocated his shoulder, a more or less kind of simple anterior shoulder dislocation. But he said once I started my exam of him, he said it never goes back in without sedation. He's like, I've done this 4 or 5 times, and every single time I need to be sedated. And he was also in just incredible pain. So we carry fentanyl, Versed, and ketamine, basically. Of course, Versed is not an analgesia, but I throw it on the list as far as the controlled substances and stuff. So anyway, like a pretty healthy dose of fentanyl was not touching him. He was just in extraordinary pain. You can imagine just the spasming and that kind of stuff. So it was basically pain refractory to fentanyl. And then, I started off at like 0.2 mg per kg ketamine. That was also not adequately addressing the pain.
Yeah, that's a conservative dose.
Yeah, pretty conservative. And so, then let's go a little higher, and a little higher. Okay. So it kind of gets to the point really quickly. I mean, this guy was, crying, shaking, dry heaving. And this guy, did not strike me as somebody who was naive to pain. He was like an ultra marathon type of a guy. That's actually what he was doing in the gorge, was training for a race. Fell, popped his shoulder out. And so, it got to the point really quickly where like, probably the best way to handle this is probably going to be a ketamine drip, and really actually disassociate him and get this shoulder back into place. So again, not in and of itself, I don't think really that exotic. I mean, this is a more or less routine procedure in an emergency department. When I was an ER tech, I lost count of the number of, sedation reductions that I assisted with. But now you're out in the wilderness, right? And you have what you have. Right, there's no additional supplies. You can't call anesthesia, and so you just have to really have a good grip on all those different components.
Yes, situation like that, you're 3 mgs per kilo for ketamine and maybe 2 mgs of midazolam would be the option.
Yep. Yep.
So I'm seeing you on the side of a cliff or out there in the middle of nowhere in this situation. Would you not use ultrasound to assess?
Yeah, so I think there's a big role for ultrasound. We have some people in our community here in Kentucky who are very skeptical of the utility of ultrasound, and I think they feel like it's not necessarily going to change a whole lot about the clinical decisions that are made there. I mean, it was like in the example we've been talking about, right? It was like a really obvious, shoulder reduction, right? So you start to bring up, ultrasound for some things like this, and some of the critics here in Kentucky would say, what's the point? You got to pack this device, and you're gonna stop, and you're gonna do an ultrasound that's gonna tell you what you probably already knew, and that kind of thing. So, I think that actually that's probably true in my particular setting. Where I think ultrasound makes a big difference is when you are in a truly austere environment. There's probably several different treatment pathways that you could go down, and there's no other imaging available, right? It's just, you're not going to get any x-rays. There's no MRI, it's just ultrasound. So we use ultrasound very frequently in another area that I am involved in. I'm on the incident management team for America's National Disaster Medical System. So these are like the DMAT teams that deploy all over the place. When we set up tents and set up our base of operation to start receiving patients, there's ultrasound in those kits, because in those tents, there's no other kind of imaging. And, in that kind of situation, it really is supposed to be probably not technically definitive care, but that's kind of the concept. Is like, we've come into a community where a hospital has been destroyed by a hurricane or, a tornado or whatever. Like, when you come into a federal DMAT tent, you're supposed to basically get the care that you need. We might still ship them out to a hospital that's in the unaffected area, if they really do need, certain kinds of tests or images or something like that. But kind of the idea is like, hey, let's do pretty much as we can, in this footprint we have laid down. So in that kind of a situation, I think ultrasound can make a big difference. I was just at this training this past week for the hoist rescue program I mentioned. I was at this training where we were practicing what's called a naked grip, and you basically, you're coming into a patient who's basically like balanced on a log in raging water. They're in extremis. You just need to make contact with them, bear hug them, yank them out of there, and basically short haul them, 10 feet to the shore, basically, just to get them to safety. Okay, so that's what we were practicing. All right, so I come in, I grab one of our victim role players. He's a big guy, and the hoist hook basically got trapped between his chest and my chest. And he's a big guy, and he's bear hugging me, and I'm bear hugging him. And after we were done with that evolution, about 45 minutes later, I mean, my right chest was just absolutely killing me, just in agony. I mean, I couldn't stand up straight. I couldn't take a full deep breath.
Wow.
I think ultrasound can be helpful there in helping to diagnose: did I bruise or tear my pec, or did I actually separate a rib?
Hmm.
And so, again, is it changing the care dramatically? I mean, probably not. But when you're in this type of a situation where somebody with that kind of an injury comes into your DMAT tent or to your field clinic or this truly austere situation, it's pretty valuable to know what is the actual nature of the injury, and it helps you anticipate the clinical course. If it's
Hmm.
if it's a separated rib or something like that, uh, there's there's some things that are going to be helpful to relieving that discomfort, versus if it's more muscular. There's things that you probably wouldn't do, for just a muscular kind of an injury, and vice versa. So, I think it's just an example of how it's a simple tool. It's getting more and more affordable. It's not that big of a deal to squirt some gel on somebody and take a quick look, and it just arms you with more knowledge. And then I think that there's applications of it where I can actually make like a really huge difference, in making some decisions about risk benefit. So, it's like you have to decide, how are we going to evacuate this head trauma patient off this mountain? Are we going to try to do it fast and therefore a little riskier, or slower? Okay, let's take a look at that optic sheath,
Hmm.
things like that. So, I'm a fan of ultrasound, but um, other people, I think, are more skeptical.
Yeah, I'm a little biased on ultrasound, of course, and I think that it's useful anywhere. So, giving your situation with someone with a dislocated shoulder, assessing anterior versus posterior, or looking at the glenoid fossa that ripped off, does that really change anything? It doesn't. But if you have two people who are injured and you're trying to ascertain which one goes on the bird first,
Right,
having that ultrasound would make a profound difference. And then at DMAT, your mass casualty, that's a no-brainer. So that is going to make a profound difference
right.
to your practice. But I think even in a back of an ambulance 20 minutes from the hospital, ultrasound is going to have its uses. And for your, I've got a couple of decades on you, David. So when you're having your right chest pain discussion, I was thinking maybe maybe having that handheld ECG and getting a 3 lead might be a good idea, but
Oh, sure.
you're
Yeah.
far too young for that problem.
Well, I'll tell you too. In this particular instance, though, I was quite sure that it was musculoskeletal. It was one of those things where here's this giant metal object that just got ground into my chest, and now my chest hurts. So, but yes, I agree with you that I think ultrasound has a lot of utility, and I think some people do get a little carried away with it. I think the like EFAST exam is overrated in a lot of situations. There's a lot of information you can get from an ultrasound, and then the question is just, okay, what's the actual utility of it? If you order a test, what are you going to do with the information you get? And you can test all kinds of different things and image all kinds of different things, and you'll probably find some things. But is it actually relevant? What are you going to do with it? So I think it's like anything else. If you have a good understanding of the value of it and how to actually apply it, it can be really helpful, just as long as you don't get too ultrasound happy.
It's a tool,
Yeah,
and there has been some discussion on the contraindications of that for somebody who's holding up a helicopter hens to do. You're right, at EFAS, when the hens guys are there waiting for you to put the patient on their bird, it's ridiculous.
right.
That's just not the time and the place for it. But they're the butterflies are so lightweight that I would definitely want to have one in my backpack if possible.
Mm-hmm.
So you've also been making quite a few waves in so the degree paramedic. Let's talk about the elephant in the room, shall we?
Sure.
So on this side of the pond, it's a no-brainer.
Yeah.
It's a requirement, and you have a degree paramedic program, and you've had it for decades, haven't you?
Correct. Yeah.
So you've been on the cutting edge of pushing for the bachelor's degree paramedic, and you have an uphill battle in front of you just to talk about the bachelor's level paramedic,
Yeah.
and it's gaining traction, and fair play to you for that. But now you just threw another hand grenade on that landmine, and you're pushing for a master's degree paramedic practitioner.
Correct.
So let's talk about that for a bit. What, for someone who's never heard of this, what is your idea? What is your goal? And what do you want this paramedic practitioner to do?
Okay, so basically here in the U.S., in with very 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 few exceptions, EMS is only reimbursed for loaded mileage. Once you get the patient in the back of the ambulance and you depart the scene, you're paid for the miles based on a certain formula, and then there's some tiers of service. And all of this is basically driven by what our Medicare and Medicaid programs pay for. And then most private insurers follow suit. So again, there are some exceptions to that reimbursement scheme, but that's basically the way that it works. Now that's just the reimbursement piece. There are many EMS agencies here in the U.S. that are financed more or less adequately by taxpayers. So some agencies really just don't really have to worry about their kind of reimbursement revenues, or it's just kind of icing on the cake, for them. But for most EMS agencies, they're very very heavily dependent on that reimbursement model, and there's also some moral hazard kind of built in to this because EMS agencies are incentivized to transport basically everybody to the hospital, because if you don't get transported or you don't transport the patient, the EMS agency basically does not get reimbursed for their expenses. And then there's a secondary problem, which is that the reimbursement rates are not sufficient to cover the actual cost of care. Okay, so that's kind of how EMS is typically financed here in the United States. Then you have kind of in another avenue, I guess, you have practitioners. So there's capital P, lowercase p practitioner, right? Many people think of themselves as practitioners and would refer to themselves as practitioners. But as far as kind of the federal government is concerned, capital P practitioner is a pretty specific list of healthcare providers that, as it happens, basically all have master's degrees. So that list includes, for example, physician assistants, nurse practitioners, and
Nurse anesthetist.
kind of depending on which provision or regulation or policy bulletin you look at, there's a few others on that list. But nurse anesthetists, registered dietitians, who actually are not required to have master's degrees right now, but they will be starting in 2024. And nurse midwives appear on some of the lists. And so, again, there's a few different, it depends kind of on which law, you kind of look at, when it was written, what kind of practitioners existed at the time. But for by and large, there's kind of a list of, 10 or so roles that the federal government basically says, here's kind of what being a practitioner really means. The federal government says these roles can submit bills for reimbursement as individual healthcare providers. So David Fifer, physician assistant, can submit a bill and get reimbursed as David Fifer, basically, for the care that he provides. And you can bill based on these different procedural codes. So, listeners might be familiar with CPT codes and vernacular like that, where it's basically, here's a little code that I'm going to type into my billing system that says I did this thing over here. And there's a lot of them, and not every practitioner is allowed to bill for every code. It has to, first of all, be in your scope of practice, but then it's also basically what the federal government, and so therefore insurers following suit, have agreed to pay a a physician assistant to do, that kind of thing. But there's a lot of them. So a kind of a good example of this is like all other things being equal. If I, as a paramedic, intubate somebody in the back of the ambulance, my EMS agency gets billed or can submit a bill for the loaded mileage, and then what would typically be an ALS 2 tier of service compared to ALS 1. And there's some other modifiers in that formula. There's rural modifiers. There's a couple of other little things like that, but that's basically what it comes down to. So I can bill a mileage and a flat rate for this a little bit more involved ALS care. Okay, well, if a PA was to intubate somebody, in their practice setting, they'd be billing for things including the assessment, the intubation, the drugs, other therapies that might be part of that mix. So, oxygenation, airway management, different assessments. For a nurse practitioner who for example, a nurse practitioner who spends time with a patient to diagnose their problem, they might be billing for patient encounter greater than 20 minutes. That's a CPT code. Okay, so the examples go on and on, but that's how practitioners basically generate their own revenue and get paid. And to do that, you have to have what's called an NPI number. And that is basically an identification number that practitioners here get assigned by the federal government. And again, I just want to stress, for the most part, the whole private insurance industry here in the United States basically emulates what the federal government does for Medicare and Medicaid. So just to be a little bit more efficient as we continue the conversation, when we talk about reimbursement, I'll basically just bundle it all into just just submitting a bill, regardless of if it goes to the feds or to a private insurer. So that's the big difference between kind of EMS financing and then these practitioners. So okay, that all being said, if we back up a little bit, that's the nuts and bolts on the policy front. What this is really about, first and foremost, is better care that is more cost effective and more efficient for patients. Patient-centered care has to be that needs to be the focus of everything that we do, right, in healthcare. So idea number one behind paramedic practitioners is doing that, is providing better care, right? Idea number two is with that premise, I hope everybody agrees kind of with that premise that we should be doing the best that we can for patients, right?
Agreed.
Let's make that financially sustainable. So how do we depart from this, predominant scheme right now where it's loaded mileage and a flat tier of service that is not sufficient for the costs of delivering the care? Like how do we break away from that? So, and then the third thing is recruitment and retention of EMS. So America right now has a big problem. It really reached a fever pitch, I think, during the pandemic of recruitment and retention. Actually, the numbers are pretty alarming. I mean, we're talking about, depending on the studies that you reference, close to 100% turnover in about a 3 to 5 year time frame on the private ambulance side, and attrition rates of greater than 60% in like 911, municipal public kinds of EMS models. So different studies, different surveys have found different numbers along those different lines, but taken together, we have a big problem here where a lot of paramedics really do not want to stay in the field working on ambulances. Okay, so those are kind of the three big thrusts of this. So what's the rationale for all of this? It goes kind of like this: the patient-centered care. All right, let's take a really easy example. There's a there's kind of a archetypical, I guess, call that people like to talk about here when they talk about the inefficiencies and the frustrations of being a paramedic and so forth. And it's the 3 a.m. toe pain. Right. So we get, I'm sure this is true around the world as well. You get these 911 calls that they're not actually an emergency. They're, somebody needs some kind of assistance or help, but it's pretty dubious that what they actually need is an ambulance or a trip to the emergency department. Okay, so a citizen calls 911 in the middle of the night for toe pain. Well, right now as a paramedic, I basically have no legal options aside from transport them to the emergency department or process their refusal of care.
Well, you can't treat and release.
Can't treat and release. Again, there are some exceptions in certain communities that have figured out how to build these, but predominantly, by and large, across the country, big cities, rural areas, different states all over the place, the predominant model is we cannot really treat and release in the way that most people probably understand that phrase. Okay, so you could, if I initiate treatments for a patient and then they decide I don't want to go to the hospital anymore, that's their prerogative, and we can't kidnap them and make them go to the hospital. So I can be doing all kinds of therapies, and then if you say, hey, that's enough for me, and I just want to be left alone now, okay, I'm going to basically probably try to talk you out of that, but if that's what you decide you want to do, then we will, quote unquote, release you. And
you don't get paid that way.
Correct. Exactly. Right. So technically that is treat and release, but that's not really intentional treat and release, right? That's like incidental treat and release. So the federal government did experiment a little bit. They did a little pilot project a couple of years ago about transporting patients to alternative destinations other than the emergency department and treat and release kinds of things. But it was not very well designed, and it was not very successful. So again, by and large, across the United States, the options are pretty much binary. Transport the patient, or the patient refuses care. And if the patient refuses care, you typically do not get reimbursed. Okay, 3 a.m. toe pain. All right. Okay, so basically the way it looks for most paramedics across the United States right now is, it's like, okay, we're going to transport this patient to the hospital, even though it seems like that is not the best thing for them. It's not the best thing for the healthcare system, kind of as a secondary imperative. And this just seems ridiculous. And these calls come in all the time. And so there's a lot of frustration. There's a lot of burnout. There's a lot of compassion fatigue. There's a lot of moral injury about, it's like, this just seems crazy, like why are we doing this? And so for a lot of paramedics, we don't have a problem getting woken up at 3:00 in the morning for somebody's toe pain. The problem is we can't do anything effective about it. And we're frustrated. We're frustrated for ourselves. We're frustrated for the patient. We're frustrated for the system that we have ownership in. Okay. So we transport this patient to the hospital, and, most paramedics are going to do what they're supposed to do. They're going to do a thorough assessment. They're going to try to figure out, what's going on with this toe. They're going to rule out, they're going to go through a differential process, and they're going to consider all the different things and give some analgesia if analgesia is indicated, but then, you take a patient like that to the emergency department. And then, very often, if that patient does not have transportation means, we'll get called back, 3 hours later to come and transfer this patient back home. So now we're doing another ambulance run, that's definitely not emergent, not no acuity whatsoever. And we're literally just a taxi at that point. And it's deeply frustrating, right? For, I think, everybody involved. The patient who may be getting a bill, the EMS system, the paramedics, on and on and on. All right. Okay, then the other option, of course, is that they just refuse care or they refuse transport. So that's deeply frustrating as well, right? Because it's like, man, I know you need some kind of medical care. It's just my hands are tied here. Like I have no other place to take you than the emergency department. Um, okay, and the reason, and of course, if that happens again, the ambulance service does not get reimbursed. Okay, the reason that this exists really is it's multifactorial. There's liability concerns and things of that nature. There's financial incentives, but I really think if you boil it all down, it comes down to the paramedic training model in the United States does not prepare us to make good decisions for that patient. We're really good at sick versus not sick. We're not good at you have a lot of comorbidities, you're diabetic, you have this, that, and the other. There's something wrong with your foot. You're in enough discomfort that you decide to call 911. You need some medical care. I'm pretty sure you don't need to go to an emergency department, but I don't quite know what to do here. Right? That's an inherent limitation of the predominant, American paramedic training model. Well,
So it's just 1 year of training. You can't get to that level, can you?
exactly. And, we do a baccalaureate paramedic program here at EKU. And even within that kind of educational model, it's difficult to really get somebody there because the United States higher education model still very heavily emphasizes general education. So, our paramedic students are definitely getting a very deep and very broad education relative to certificate paramedics here in the US, but a lot of the hours that they spend are spent in general liberal arts, which are very
Art
valuable.
history and geology and
Yes,
and
economics,
studies
sociology,
yeah.
arts and culture. That information is very valuable. I'm a big believer in it. It's what makes a well-rounded, well-educated individual, but it is a little bit different than some of the educational models around the world where a bachelor's degree in emergency medical care would be significantly much more focused on clinical knowledge.
Yeah, our 3 year bachelor's paramedic program doesn't have a single class that's not medical.
Right. So okay, so by and large in the United States, paramedics are not well prepared for this kind of thing. So there's literature on how we don't make very safe decisions for patients on this front. We can if we get additional education. And so there are some systems that have experimented with giving their paramedics more education, more training for these kinds of populations, and their outcomes are pretty good. But without that, the outcomes are not great. Okay, so that's kind of the quintessential kind of scenario, right? Okay, so enter the idea of paramedic practitioners. This would be a paramedic who has clinically focused graduate education. So we're not talking about a master's degree in EMS administration or EMS leadership or something like that. We're talking about a clinical training model that would very closely emulate physician assistants, nurse practitioners, nurse anesthetists.
So clinical time,
exactly,
as well as a deeper dive into medical time.
Exactly, but also system navigation, social determinants of health. What is the ability of this patient to follow a care plan that you lay out? What kind of specialists exist out there in the community, and who do they really need to go see? Do they need to see a podiatrist? Do they need to see a orthopedist? Do they need to see specialist for their diabetes because it's diabetic neuropathy or something like that? So it's that kind of stuff, right? In addition to the clinical knowledge. Okay, so paramedic practitioner, responds to this kind of a call. Instead of sending an ambulance, we're going to send a paramedic practitioner in basically a sedan or a SUV or something like that. And we assess this guy and hey, maybe I even pull out my ultrasound and I look at this toe and there's crystals in his joint. And, based on an assessment, I say, hey, I think this is gout. And I know you're in a lot of pain right now, but we can handle this here. So let me give you some Toradol. Let me go ahead and give you a shot of Toradol, Ketorolac, and let me call in a prescription for anti-gout medication that will be ready for you tomorrow morning. And if you have transportation issues or whatever, the day shift paramedic practitioner will go ahead and pick up that prescription for you and bring it over. The day shift paramedic is also going to come by over the next few days, paramedic practitioner, for follow up, make sure that this hasn't gotten worse, all that kind of thing. Let me also refer you to a dietitian so we can talk about how to keep this from happening again. Let me give you a little bit of education right now about gout and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so now the patient is getting much better care focused on their real need in their home. They don't have to go to the emergency department, which is typically an uncomfortable experience for most people. The emergency department is not overwhelmed with these subacute kinds of cases that the providers in the emergency department don't really want to handle. The bean counters at the hospital might still want to handle them. That's kind of a different story. But the typical emergency department clinician is just as burnt out by these kinds of calls as a 911 paramedic is. We also just saved the healthcare system a ton of money. Okay, so when we transport the patient, the ambulance service submits a bill, but then there's like an immediate, $2,000-$3,000 workup, sometimes even more, in the emergency department that gets sent to either the federal government or to private insurers, all to be able to say this person has gout. Okay, well, how about a paramedic practitioner submits a bill instead of for several thousands of dollars for a few $100s of those CPT codes, like patient encounter greater than 20 minutes, patient education, administering the Toradol, the referral, that kind of stuff. And so, we're saving money, we're providing better care, more efficient care, we're reducing pressure on the hospital system and also on the 911 system. We're minimizing the burnout and the moral injury and the frustration and the resentment that everybody experiences. And I, as the paramedic practitioner, am happier because I can actually do something about this. I can actually do some good old-fashioned medicine for my patient. I can meet their need in a way that makes sense for them. I can resolve their pain. I can try to put them on a better path with, diet and better health choices and all that kind of stuff. And I'm making some small difference. It's not sexy. It's toe pain, but I like medicine, right? I'd like to have this kind of an opportunity to be able to do this kind of care. And as it turns out, the survey data indicates that a lot of paramedics feel the same way that I do. A lot of paramedics are eager for the opportunity to practice at a higher level with expanded abilities. They want to be able to do the right thing for these kinds of patients, and they feel like they can't now by just taking them to the hospital. And so they get frustrated and they bail. They leave the field, they go to nursing school, or they go to PA school, or they just leave EMS entirely because they're so frustrated by it. Well, okay, to do what I just described safely, for one thing, you just need more education. You just need more education in how to differentiate gout from cellulitis, from diabetic neuropathy, from a dislocated toe, from an infection, all that kind of stuff. And you just don't get it in a typical paramedic education. And so you need more education, you need more clinical exposure, you need to see more kinds of patients, different kinds of patients. You need to understand different kinds of tests, different kinds of diseases. You need to understand how to navigate the healthcare system. You need to understand healthcare finance. And so you really need a graduate level of education to be able to do that. Even though it doesn't sound complicated, it is kind of complicated. And then the last thing that I would just point out is that even if you didn't need a graduate level of education to do that, the federal government basically says you have to have a graduate degree in order to get that NPI number to be able to bill for this and provide these services. So I know I've talked a lot just now, but kind of what this all comes down to is the paramedic practitioner concept is an opportunity to retain paramedics who are passionate about medicine. It's an opportunity to provide better patient-centered care. It's an opportunity to access new streams of revenue for EMS agencies, for financial sustainability. And it follows the pathway that the federal government here in the United States has already laid out for how to do this. We don't have to reinvent the landscape. The statutes already exist. The regulations already exist. The concept of practitioners already exists. What paramedics need to do is just follow that pathway, just adhere to that standard, just walk down that yellow brick road, basically, that federal government's already laid out. And what we've proposed in this, what I have proposed basically is this would be an optional role. This is not something that every paramedic has to do. This isn't something that necessarily makes sense for every healthcare system. It's just an optional role. Not every nurse becomes a nurse practitioner or a nurse anesthetist, but for those paramedics who want to do this kind of care, for those communities where this would benefit their systems, let's set up this opportunity to create a category of paramedics that are practitioners.
There's precedence.
Yeah.
So in the UK, there's master's level paramedics. They're called emergency care practitioners that treat and release, that have the additional skills and knowledge to deal with a toe pain. So you're not reinventing the wheel, David. Other people have been doing this for 20 years, and you can rely on that research to push us through.
Right. And we have started to talk about some of that. Now, one of the things we have to be kind of careful about here in the United States is there is sometimes this reflexive sort of a thing where, we'll say, well, this is how, look at these precedents in the United Kingdom, in Canada, to a certain extent, in Australia. And people say, well, that's different. That's the United States is different. We're different for all these reasons. And the one interesting thing I hear all the time is, well, the only reason this works in those systems is because it's basically socialized medicine. Well, here in the United States, we also have socialized medicine. It's called Medicare, Medicaid. And a lot of Americans are on it. We don't have a fully socialized system. I mean, I think America's private health insurance market is pretty infamous, actually, around the world at this point. But
indeed,
but we don't not have socialized medicine. We have Medicare, Medicaid. We have the VA. So the Veterans Affairs Administration here in the United States operates many hospitals around the country and provides socialized medical care to their beneficiaries. And EMS services all over the country transport many veterans to Veterans Affairs hospitals. So many EMS patients,
they're pretty good.
They
in
are.
My experience.
Yeah. The VA as a department of the government is problematic, but the clinicians at VA hospitals are just as skilled and dedicated as any you'll find at any private hospital. So we transport a lot of basically beneficiaries of fully socialized medicine. So for the people out there whose critique of this is, well, it would never work because we have a different healthcare model. I don't think that's as true as some people would like to think it is. I also I'm not even sure it's relevant. I mean, this really has very little to do with the model of healthcare financing, whether it's predominantly private or predominantly public. It's really just about let's emulate the standards of education that other practitioners have already embraced. And then what this really takes is it's kind of a couple of things. The first is that the federal government would have to recognize paramedic practitioners. So we would need action on the part of the federal government. And it could come from a few different places. It could be congressional action. It could be executive action. So in other words, basically a directive from the president or some of his cabinet secretaries. There's a few different kind of ways to skin that cat. But we do need to be recognized by the federal government. And then private insurers would also need to basically embrace this. But when you look at the cost savings to those kinds of payers, I think that they would. I think if we said, hey, instead of basically, a $5,000 bill for this toe pain to be transported to an emergency department when it's all said and done, how about a $500 bill for a paramedic practitioner to basically do a intentional treat and release in a way that is safe and appropriate for the patient. I think that payers will be excited about that.
That's the hope. Yeah.
Yep. And then of course the for the paramedic, there's the compensation aspect, right? So kind of without getting into too many of the weeds, right? If I just basically generated $500 for my EMS agency that they otherwise would not have gotten, because right now that kind of a scenario is, refusal is unreimbursed, and they only get paid for the loaded mileage and a service tier, which is not adequate to meet costs. Okay, well, as a paramedic practitioner, I basically just reduced your costs. We did not send a $250,000 ambulance with two providers on it. You sent me in a car with a jump bag, basically. So I basically overall just reduced your costs, and I generated revenue for you in a space where you wouldn't have had revenue coming in before. So now we're going to do a little cost sharing. So if we just got $500, reimbursed from payers, maybe the system keeps 200 and I keep 300, or vice versa, whatever. But there's a cost sharing model. So now we're making more money as a system. I am basically getting extra money on top of what you would have paid me anyway as a paramedic. And so now I'm happy. The cost of my education is starting to make sense. I'm having a better standard of living. You're making more money. Everybody is winning. The patient is not getting as large of a bill for whatever is not covered by their plans. The payers are not paying as much. I mean, it's win-win-win all around. And now we've also created a clinical ladder for EMTs and paramedics to aspire to. So just like people a lot of times get into nursing because they want to become a nurse practitioner, or they leave paramedicine to become a PA, we now have a clinical ladder, still optional. We're not requiring anybody to go to college. We're only requiring you to go to college if you want to be a paramedic practitioner. We have a clinical ladder now where you could say, okay, I'm going to put in my time on the streets, running these 911 calls as an EMT, as a paramedic, whatever. And I'm going to develop that skill set, that acumen, that experience. But if this is something that's attractive to me, now I have a pathway where I can become a little bit more efficacious. I get a little bit more autonomy. I can do more for my patients, so on and so forth. And I get to make more money, have a different kind of a schedule, have a different kind of a work life style. And that's a big part of what we're missing in EMS. So when you look at surveys, workforce surveys, a lot of EMTs and paramedics say that they leave the field because of a lack of opportunity. And I think that's true for a lot of paramedics. Like, yes, you can maybe, get a job as a flight paramedic. You can get into, wilderness medicine, tactical medicine, these other kinds of kind of niche, specialties. But for most paramedics, you hit a ceiling pretty quickly in your career. After about 5 years or so in an ambulance, it's like, okay, I've kind of seen it, done it. There's not a whole lot of calls at this point that kind of surprise me anymore. And, if you work for a large agency, there might be opportunities to become a training officer or a administrator or this or that, or what, but in a lot of communities, it's small ambulance services. They don't have all that kind of, enterprise where you can have these different career pathways. And so it's like, okay, I guess I'm going to ride an ambulance for the rest of my career, or just leave the field to be able to try to do other stuff. And so
and not many people could do 30 days or 30 years on this, especially with, back issues of lifting things.
Yeah.
This gives options.
And it gives you options. And so we then start to emulate our peers in other aspects of healthcare who have these pathways, right? Nursing has their clinical ladder. Even in other fields, like, physical therapy, which is sometimes considered a practitioner in certain regs. There's physical therapy assistants, and then there's physical therapists, and then there's doctors of physical therapists, or doctors of physical therapy, and so we need we need those kinds of pathways for paramedics.
So you're thinking of two jumps, one from NRP to BSc, and then another one from BSc to MSc. Will there be a change in the BSc to put more medicine and less leadership? Or would you at EKU create a BSc pathway that teaches advanced medicine in preparation for the MSc?
Yeah, so we actually have one right now. So here at EKU, I mean, what you're saying is it's important to recognize there is no standard curriculum for baccalaureate degrees in the United States for paramedics. So if you're a certificate paramedic, I guess there is. I mean, there is. It's not an I guess. I mean, there is. There's national educational guidelines. There's national educational standards. There's the National Registry exam. So if you are a nationally registered paramedic here in the United States, you basically followed the same curriculum as pretty much everybody else. And then there's institutions that might take that knowledge deeper and farther, but ultimately everybody takes the same nationally registered paramedic exam. Okay, as far as the deeper farther, right, there's probably about 24 baccalaureate paramedic programs in the United States, and some benchmark with each other and are similar to one another, and then others are doing something totally different. So there's no real standard. Unlike, right, a Bachelor of Science of Nursing or a Master of Science of Physician Assistant Studies, it's not like that on the baccalaureate level for EMS. But here at EKU, we actually have 3 different kind of pathways that students can follow right now. The first is EMS administration. The second is basically fire and EMS operations. And then the third is what we call the paramedic clinical science track. And that is actually a pre-PA, pre-med program. So it's very clinically rigorous. It's very scientifically heavy. The students take a lot of what's referred to in higher ed as the hard sciences. They happen to be cognitively hard, academically hard, but they're the hard sciences compared to the liberal arts and sciences, if you will. And so that's things like physics, OChem, biochem,
organic chemistry.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, our students in our paramedic clinical science track, they do get a very clinically rigorous, very scientifically rigorous paramedic training experience. And most of those students have no problem getting into medical school or PA school. And most of them go on to become EMS physicians or PAs who are still involved in EMS in some way, which is pretty cool. So we like that a lot. So yes, to go to graduate school, you typically, at least, admittedly, I'm actually not familiar with like maybe European models, but here in the United States, basically to get a graduate degree, you have to have a bachelor's degree. So an incidental benefit of creating paramedic practitioners would be it would incentivize more paramedics to get bachelor's degrees. But I am actually not totally convinced that you should need to have a EMS focused or clinically focused bachelor's degree to be a paramedic practitioner, and here's why. There's, here in the US, we have this concept of community paramedicine. I think it exists elsewhere in the world, but the concept here is, instead of just reactive, you call 911, we send an ambulance. We're going to send paramedics with special training out in the community to try to prevent reliance on the 911 system, to try to provide better care. Very similar to the kinds of things we're talking about with paramedic practitioners. But where this ends up getting utilized a lot in a lot of major United States cities is with the indigent population, homeless population. A lot of mental health challenges there, a lot of substance abuse challenges there, a lot of comorbidities, that kind of stuff. So you have these teams that go out and try to help these people. And what a lot of cities have done is they've partnered a social worker with a paramedic. And they just kind of ride around as a team and try to kind of intercede, early intervention kinds of stuff for these patients. Well, in my mind, who better to participate in a program like that than a paramedic practitioner who has a bachelor's degree in social work?
That's a good point.
Yep. So how about I get a bachelor's degree in social work and I get my paramedic certificate. I pass the National Registry exam. And then I go to paramedic practitioner school. And then I do a fellowship in mental health, or I do a residency in mental health, or that sort of thing. So I think this is actually somewhat common in medicine. I mean, I was just speaking with a physician. He's an EMS physician, board certified EMS physician. He's actually very well known here in the United States. I don't want to maybe name names just in case I mischaracterize any of this, but he's a emergency medical physician that many people here in the United States EMS community would know and respect. His undergraduate degree, if I am recalling correctly, is something in fine arts. I can't recall exactly what it is, but it's something in that realm, art history or art appreciation or something along those lines. And he's an immensely talented EMS physician. As an educator, that makes sense to me because I know the power of a well-rounded education. I know that a arts education helps you see patterns, helps you connect ideas, helps you appreciate subtleties, literally helps you appreciate visual nuances, like the subtle ECG, the subtle changes in a pleth waveform, those sorts of things. So it's valuable to be well-educated and well-rounded and have a diverse perspective. So I'm not convinced you need to have an EMS degree to become a paramedic practitioner, but I think that will basically be what happens for most people kind of organically. You know what I mean? Most people are going to say, well, it's just going to make sense for me to get a EMS bachelor's degree and then continue on to paramedic practitioner school.
That's a little different than here in Europe, where from zero to hero, you're studying one thing.
Right. Yeah. So I think, people could probably debate that back and forth all day long. And if anybody wants me to come over to Europe and debate it with them over a pint, I am happy to do so. But that is my perspective. I mean, I do believe in a well-rounded individual with broad perspective. But like I said, I just think that naturally you're going to see most people probably pursue a bachelor's degree in EMS to prepare them to go to paramedic practitioner school. The standard post-nominal, I guess, that I have proposed is an MSP, Master of Science in Paramedicine. And I think you basically see that right now in like other fields as well. Like there's a lot of people who get into nursing as a second career. So they have some other degree, then they get a nursing degree, then they move on in the nursing field. But most people still, it's like, hey, I'm going to go to college when I'm 17 or 18 years old. I'm going to get a degree in nursing. I'm going to start my nursing career as a young person. I'm going to follow through. I'm going to progress and work my way all the way up to an advanced practice nurse or a nurse manager or nurse specialist or nurse midwife or CRNA. So I just think we need to not close the door on individuals who have other kinds of degrees that would be beneficial to our profession. And honestly, at the risk of some self-aggrandizement, I think I'm a good example of this. My undergraduate degree is in political science. So wow. I would argue that my undergraduate education prepared me to be able to write an advisory for NEMSAC and develop state regulations for wilderness paramedic practitioners and do some of the other things I've done in that sort of public regulatory sphere. And I think that my political science education has been helpful to the EMS systems that I am affiliated with. So
agreed.
Yeah, I think that stuff's important to be able to validate, I guess, within the profession. So I hope we don't turn this into a thing where you have to have a certain kind of undergraduate degree to become a paramedic practitioner. But I think that, again, most people will basically follow the logical path of EMS degrees all the way up to the advanced level.
So that's your goal for the paramedic practitioner master's program. What's the way forward from here? Where can someone get more information about this, or what help do you need to push this forward?
So a couple of things need to happen more or less sort of simultaneously. The first is educational programs need to be built. So universities that have the resources need to build MSP programs. And then the second thing is that state scope of practice would need to reflect, or state EMS regulations would need to reflect the paramedic practitioner level and give it a scope of practice, I guess. And then a lot of states here have what's called a state health plan. And that's basically where the federal government, the Medicare and Medicaid program, basically say, hey, here's, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars to give to your citizens through Medicare and Medicaid. You need to have a plan for how you're going to do that and where that money is going to go and who's going to receive it. So, basically a state EMS office needs to go ahead and create paramedic practitioners, define the scope, define the educational requirements, and then get it included in the state health plans so that the Medicare Medicaid programs would actually pay for it, pay for the services. And then kind of the third thing, of course, is at the federal level, this would really need to be, ultimately needs to be recognized. So there are some provisions of federal law where Congress might need to act. And individuals who want to see this happen would need to start lobbying their Congress people for it. But then there's other aspects of or other provisions of federal regulations and law where, again, it could be a directive of, for example, the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services here in the United States does have the ability to designate roles as practitioners. So, there's like a few different laws and regs that apply to this, and some would need to be changed by Congress. Some could be basically changed through executive decisions because the law already permits them to do that. So, for example, here in the United States, the Social Security Act empowers the Secretary of Health and Human Services to add people to the practitioner list, so that they could do that if they wanted to. Those are some of the kind of nuts and bolts that would need to occur. And that sounds maybe a little crazy, like a lot of different things have to happen at once, but I really don't think it's that crazy. So for example, if we use my state, there's very, very little stopping the Kentucky Board of EMS right now from creating this. They could just say, hey, here's a new thing, paramedic practitioners. To be a paramedic practitioner, you need to obtain a graduate degree in paramedicine, basically. However you want to word that, right? The devil's probably in the details, but that would be the thrust of it. And then define a scope of practice. Paramedic practitioners can write prescriptions, and they can do patient disposition, and they can order tests, and blah 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 blah. Okay, that can just exist out in the world just through the action of the Kentucky Board of EMS by themselves. Maybe no MSP programs ever get created. Maybe nobody ever funds it. It can still live in our state EMS regulations. That's what happened with wilderness paramedicine. We wrote the law that created advanced practice wilderness paramedics before WPC existed. So we did that because we knew we were going to figure out a way to do it. We just didn't know how. It ended up being IBSC, but if it hadn't been IBSC, we just would have written our own state test, right? So we wrote it into law because we wanted to create it. And once it created, once that language was there, then that was the impetus for everything else. So, okay, our Board of EMS could go ahead and do this. Okay, then we could go turn to our state, basically health department, and we could say, hey, let's talk about adding this into the state health plan, and let's do a pilot project. Let's do a demonstration project. The federal government is not going to reimburse paramedic practitioners for this kind of care. But if we could carve out a couple $1 million, we could try this experiment in a couple of communities here in Kentucky, and we could see what the outcomes are over the course of, the next, period of measurement. And there you go. We could just do this on the state level. But of course,
that worked for the community paramedic.
Exactly.
They did
exactly.
That, and they showed evidence.
This is what many communities have done for community paramedicine. That's exactly right. The federal government does not reimburse community paramedicine. It's basically just states and localities who are deciding to fund it because they recognize the benefit and they recognize the cost savings. So the same thing could be done for paramedic practitioners. And then ultimately, we do have to get included in federal regulation, but that's what nurse practitioners did. The first nurse practitioners were created basically back in the 1950s. And they existed.
That far back.
Yeah, they existed
Wow.
for decades before they were included in federal law in 1999. They built their programs, they built doctorate programs, they produced nurse practitioners, and they just did it because they believed in it. And they did some politicking. There's a whole history of how nurse practitioners engage with their congresspeople, started kind of inculcating the ideas into the social fabric and social dialogue by providing really great care, and then asking their patients to call their congress people and say, hey, I just got great care from this nurse practitioner in my town. You really need to include them in the ability to get reimbursed by my insurance plan or Medicare or Medicaid, right? So they had a whole plan for how they were going to lobby for this, and then it paid off, and they got added to federal statute as practitioners in 1999. So we can build a lot of this without federal action, but ultimately we're going to need federal action at some point to make it really sustainable. As far as what people can do if they're just interested in kind of following along with this, NEMSAC meetings are streamed live. So people can go to the NEMSAC website and they can basically sign up, and they will be given, they'll get emailed information about how to view the meetings. There are public comment periods during the meeting, so people can submit comments either for or against this idea, and we have gotten some comments against it. Not everybody loves it, but people can comment if they have opinions on it. So then I think the other thing is, and again, I say this just purely kind of as a poli-sci guy about how this stuff gets done, not necessarily advocating for any specific course of action here. But ideas need to be talked about. It takes a long time sometimes for just people to get comfortable with ideas, and this one has a lot of pieces to it. So I think some people have already started to misinterpret this one as about degree requirements. It's not an end run around that issue. This is not a proposal that is requiring any paramedic to go to school to get a degree. It would only require paramedics who want to be paramedic practitioners to get degrees. So that's an important thing to understand. And then it's just the whole idea of like, why would we do this? What is all this? NPIs, CPTs, practitioners, graduate degrees. We have to kind of talk about this a lot for people to understand it. And sometimes it takes just talking about things a lot to get people comfortable with new ideas. So, people need to, I think if they are passionate about this and they do want to see it happen, just start kind of socializing the idea, if you know what I mean.
What way could someone contact you, David?
Well, I'm very active on social media, so people can typically find me fairly easily on Facebook and LinkedIn and Instagram as well. And my bio on those sites makes it pretty clear which of the many David Fifers I am. I'm not so active on X anymore, whatever that is, Twitter.
Yeah, that kind of fell flat.
Yeah, that I've kind of bailed on that, but so I probably have a Twitter X inbox filled with unread messages because I haven't done a whole lot there in a long time, but pretty active on LinkedIn. And so if people want to find me there, again, David, all my post nominals are in my name, and my bio talks about being a paramedic and being a wilderness guy. So you can find me pretty easily on there, and I'm always happy to engage with people and share ideas.
Well, you've definitely kicked a hornet's nest. You've taken the lead, the points, in making this conversation happen, and I am fascinated with where this is going to go, and I have a vast amounts of respect for you to take this ball and run.
Well, thanks very much. It's very kind, and quite a compliment coming from you. I have admired you for a long time, and I think I told you the first time we met, actually, I'd been a follower of yours for a long time before we had the opportunity to meet. It was a real thrill to do so because you've really carved out what it means to be an austere medical professional. And I know that you kind of are a man of both worlds. You're firsthand experience with the U.S. EMS system, firsthand experience with the European and African healthcare systems, and probably other places that I'm not even aware of. And so, if this dog hunts with you, and this doesn't immediately sound like a crazy idea to you, then maybe I got something here.
You have something here.
Well, cool.
Let's see what you can do.
Well, thanks very much.
Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And we look forward to seeing where this goes.
Yeah, same. Thank you.
This has been a presentation from the College of Remote and Offshore Medicine. If you would like to earn CPD credits for this podcast, you can join the Council of Members. Being a member of the college gives you free CPD credit, free access to our virtual field guide, and discounts on our e-learning courses. You can join the team on our college website at quorum.edu.mt.